Following Henry VIII's break from Rome in 1534, England experienced several years of religious upheaval and the establishment of national Catholicism, a state-backed version of Catholicism characterized by government control over spiritual matters. This period saw a series of dramatic shifts, from Henry's initial creation of the Church of England to the Protestant reforms of Edward VI and the bloody Catholic comeback during Mary I's reign. England was undoubtedly a Christian nation, but within Christianity, people disagreed on exactly what practices and beliefs to follow. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne, she had to deal not only with the Christians, but also with the Protestants who were returning from exile after her sister's persecution. Worst of all, the returning Protestants didn't unanimously agree on what type of Protestantism to follow. Some were Puritans, other Lutherans, other Calvinists, and even Zwinglians. But don't worry, we're only going to focus on Catholic, Protestants, and Puritans. So, what do all these fancy names mean? Before continuing, we must understand the difference between the various religious beliefs in England at the time. The Catholics believed that the Pope in Rome was the absolute head of the Church, followed by cardinals, bishops, and priests. On the contrary, Protestants did not follow the Pope, but still believed in the importance of archbishops and bishops, and the extreme Puritans didn't think any of them were necessary. Christians believed that the Church was a link between God and the people, and had the authority to forgive sins. In contrast, Protestants and Puritans believed that this connection with God was only between the individual and God, who was the only authority that could forgive sins. These two groups disagreed on several more issues. Christians believed in the 7 sacraments, and Protestants and Puritans only in 2. Christians believed services should only be held in the original Latin, and priests should wear fancy clothes, while Protestants and Puritans thought that they should be in English, and priests should wear simple clothes. Christians believed that priests should remain celibate, while Protestants and Puritans allowed them to marry. And geographically, these groups also lived in different parts of the Isles, with Christians centered in the north and west of England, and Protestants and Puritans living within the south and the west. I could go on and on about these differences, but what you should know is that these differences had divided and increased tensions in England. So, now that we understand the significance of these terms, what were Elizabeth's personal religious beliefs? As mentioned in the last episode, Elizabeth was raised under her father's Protestant values and was influenced by Henry VIII's sixth wife, the Protestant Catherine Parr. But Elizabeth also conformed to his sister's strict Catholic rule. So, Elizabeth's exact religious stance remains somewhat of an enigma, as she didn't elaborate much on her beliefs. Cambridge historian Richard Rex characterizes her approach to religion as designed to elicit particular responses from particular audiences at particular times, which basically means that she was an opportunist. Still, sufficient evidence suggests that Elizabeth I was both religious and interested in Protestantism. In 1559, much of England's population still followed Catholic beliefs and practices. Therefore, Elizabeth adopted religious policies that did not turn away Catholics and drive them against her regime. Unlike her sister Mary's method, Elizabeth did not persecute Catholics, well, except for those who threatened her rule, as we'll see in the second half of this video. Still, Elizabeth was smart, and she understood that she could not allow Catholicism to dominate England. She knew that from the Catholic point of view, she was nothing more than an illegitimate bastard child, as her father's divorce from Catherine of Aragon was never recognized by the Pope. As the Elizabethan religious settlements proved, the Queen still cared about influencing her religious values in English society. So, let's take a look at what these settlements changed and how they attempted to appease different religious groups in England. The Elizabethan religious settlements established in 1559 aimed to firmly position Elizabeth's Protestant views in English Christianity and remove the Pope's authority from England, while at the same time seeking to appease Catholics, Puritans, and other Protestant groups such as Lutherans, Calvinists, and Zwinglians. Elizabeth hoped to compromise by passing several laws on how religion should run in England, but we're only going to focus on the 1559 Act of Uniformity and the 1559 Act of Supremacy. The Act of Uniformity dealt with how the church was organized. It made church attendance mandatory on Sunday and holy days and creates the new Book of Common Prayer. Although angering both Catholics and Puritans, Elizabeth retained some Catholic traditions, which she hoped would keep everybody happy. The Act of Supremacy made Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England. Therefore, all clergy and royal officials had to swear an oath of allegiance to her, eliminating the Pope from the equation. She specifically chose the wording Supreme Governor instead of Supreme Head to compromise with the extreme Catholics and Puritans who believed that a woman could not hold a position of such religious power. Also, by making the clergy swear an oath, Elizabeth could distinguish between loyal subjects and possible threats to her reign. And that's the perfect transition to the second part of this video, which will discuss the instability and threats that followed these acts. Although Elizabeth attempted to play both sides by still allowing Catholic practices in private, many Catholics in England were unhappy with Elizabeth's settlements. This discontent brewed tensions and became a growing threat to Elizabeth's stability, which first blew up with the 1569 Northern Rebellion. But first, we must discuss a crucial figure in Elizabeth's reign, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Henry VII's great-granddaughter and Elizabeth's second cousin. Most importantly, if you agree that Henry's divorce with Catherine of Aragon was not allowed under Christianity, and therefore Elizabeth was illegitimate, Mary Queen of Scots was the legitimate heir to the throne of England. Mary was the daughter of the Scottish King James V and the French Mary of Guise. Being James V's only daughter, she became the Queen of Scotland at just 6 days of age. At her mother's request, she was sent to France at the age of 5 and raised Catholic. She returned to Scotland in 1561, but her sheltered upbringing in France did not prepare her for the return to the Highlands, where the political landscape was quite hostile to her return. After a series of tragic events, including the possible assassination of her second husband, Mary escaped and sought refuge in England, only to be held captive by her cousin Elizabeth I for 18 years. If you have to remember one thing about Mary Queen of Scots, it is that she was Elizabeth's biggest threat and a pawn for many of Elizabeth's enemies to gain popular support and legitimacy. So, now that we know about Mary Queen of Scots, let us return to the 1569 Northern Rebellion. Fueled by the alienation of Northern earls and Elizabeth's reluctance to name an heir, the Duke of Norfolk planned to marry Mary Queen of Scots, remove Elizabeth from power, and, with the assistance of Spain, take over the now Catholic England. At first, the revolt looked promising as the Duke of Norfolk and his 6,000 supporters took over and held mass in Durham Cathedral, but support from Spain never arrived. A vast army sent by Elizabeth crushed the revolt, and 800 rebels were put to death, ending the Northern Rebellion. Although the revolt failed, it proved that Mary was a legitimate threat to Elizabeth. A year later, in 1570, Elizabeth was excommunicated by the Pope. She was called the heretic and the pretend queen, which motivated Catholics around England to go against the Queen's role, sparking up several rebellions in the years to come. In 1571, Italian banker Roberto Ridolfi planned to assassinate Elizabeth and make Mary queen. He supposedly had the support from Philip II, the Duke of Norfolk, and Mary herself, but William Cecil discovered the plot, and Ridolfi was exiled, never to return to England again. As for the Duke of Norfolk, this was his second offense, and Elizabeth didn't hesitate to make an example of him by executing him in 1572. As for Mary, Elizabeth decided to keep her alive, as her execution could possibly result in an alliance between France and Spain against England, which Elizabeth could not afford. In 1583, after a decade of relative peace, a young Catholic lawyer, Francis Throckmorton, organized a plan to get the Pope and Philip II to pay for the French army to invade England and replace Elizabeth with, you guessed it, Mary Queen of Scots. However, Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster who we learned about in the first episode, discovered the so-called Throckmorton plot, leading to the torture and execution of its mastermind. 3 years later, in 1586, the Duke of Guise, who had collaborated with the previous plot, once again planned to invade England, murder Elizabeth, and, you guessed it again, place Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. Philip II and the Pope supported the rebellion, and a Catholic named Anthony Babington served as a connection by encrypting and sending letters to Mary. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but once again, Walsingham intercepted the letter sent to Mary, this time proving her direct connection in the plot. The plotters were arrested and hung, and Elizabeth had had enough. In October 1586, Mary was sentenced to death for treason. Still, Elizabeth delayed her death, as she did not wish to kill her cousin. But on the 8th of February 1587, Mary Queen of Scots was executed. The Catholics weren't Elizabeth's only threat. The Puritans also posed challenges during her reign. The strict Protestant group initially accepted Elizabeth's settlements, but later campaigned for further reforms, advocating for the banning of activities like theater and gambling and promoting a simpler style of worship with no images or decoration in churches. Some of Elizabeth's closest advisors, such as Walsingham and Robert Dudley, were Puritans, although they kept their beliefs to themselves. While not as threatening as their Catholic counterparts, Elizabeth became increasingly less accepting of Puritan ideas and practices by the late 1580s. Through a series of rules, including prohibiting members of Parliament from discussing religious matters without her permission, and imposing punishments like fines and even cutting hands, Elizabeth managed to control the group and mitigate any danger they posed. Thanks for watching. The next video in this series will explore life in Elizabethan England and English sailors.